I know this is not the attitude in which you normally find me. I'm sitting back in my $10 thrift store chair in my at least temporary office that I'm renting down the street from my house in order to get away from loud children over the summer and likely over the year. Just sitting here reading my Kindle Scribe that was purchased for me in part by a King James only pastor who sent me $200 of Amazon gift card money out of gratitude to me. That was really something. Anyway, I'm reading Garner's Modern English Usage, the authority on grammar, usage, and style. I have not really read much Garner in the past. I was aware that he is considered an authority, maybe the authority on modern American usage and style, meaning he knows how to write good. I've really enjoyed reading the preface and just getting into a little portion of the book. The reason I found it so interesting is that after all these years of my thinking very carefully, I have to say, about prescriptive usage and descriptive usage, that is, should we follow the rules or should we merely describe without judgment the way in fact people do write? I had already transcended that to some degree. I have called myself a descriptivist, prescriptivist. That is, the rules for grammar and writing and style and spelling and pronunciation that I appeal to ultimately derive from a description of the way well-educated, good writers and speakers do in fact write and speak. That's where we get the rules. But I feel as if Garner has taken steps beyond me. Well, of course he has. That's silly. Not only has he given judgments, pronouncements on all kinds of usage questions, he also has a very brief and effective preface in which he talks about that matter of descriptivism versus prescriptivism. In a little informal chat here, I want to take us through some of his insights and how they apply to English Bible translation and debates over English Bible translations. Let's kick back, relax, and let Garner teach us. One of the first things that I highlighted in his book is a question. Is the English language decaying? Was it once in a pristine state? Has it been sliding ever since? I know my answer to those questions, and I was relieved to see Garner say, no on all counts. This is a key point made by even the most reasonable King James defenders, the ones who aren't onlyists. They lament the alleged decline of quality in English and give that as a reason for why we simply cannot dumb down the Bible by using modern English. But here is the authority on modern English, and he's been that for quite some time. He worked with Antonin Scalia of the Supreme Court on textualism, originalism, I can't remember which one they adopt, there's one, and on writing and style stuff for Supreme Court justices. He's not considered a liberal at all, not when it comes to writing, at least. I don't know what his political persuasion is. And he says the English language is not decaying. In many ways, writing today is better than ever. Our best journalists and authors are as talented as any who have ever worked in the language. Did you catch that? I've said something very similar. I said in Authorize that if C.S. Lewis's prose has some sort of degenerate disease, that I would love to catch that disease. But a great deal of mediocre writing also appears in print and online, and both written and oral assaults on the language do seem to come at high velocities. The speed comes from mass communication and social media. Sign on to almost any social media platform and you'll be treated to the heights of inarticulacy. Then imagine all the millions of readers and viewers whose linguistic perceptions are affected by this blather. Okay, so he's establishing his bona fides, which Garner clarifies ought to be pronounced bona fides, because I think it comes from legal context, but he actually tends to say that you should say good faith in most settings rather than bona fides, although the usage I just used is one of the senses that he still employs. Anyway, he establishes his bona fides by complaining pretty acidly there with about modern English and the way that some people are messing it up by blather. That's a word that you use when you are in high moral dudgeon. But he says there are good clarifying forces at work on the language. There are also bad obscuring forces at work. One language, many realities. I can imagine a King James defender saying, well, it's the bad forces that are working on the modern English Bible translations. But I really challenge you to go to the NIV, the ESV, the CSB, the NASB, and find places where blather has inserted itself, where text speech and where those articles that pop up that seem like they were written by AI before there was AI, mindless drone people writing these silly articles. Show me somewhere where that language has supposedly intruded into the modern English versions. No, that has not happened. They tend to be rather formal as English writing goes. Garner is in high moral dudgeon for just a moment, but ultimately and most fundamentally, he's optimistic. He says, the reality I care about most is that some people still want to use the language well. They want to write effectively. They want to speak effectively. They want their language to be graceful at times and powerful at times. I certainly do. They want to understand how to use words well, how to phrase sentences, and how to move about in the language without seeming to flail. They want good grammar, but they want more. They want rhetoric in the traditional sense, that is, the art of persuasion. I certainly want that. That is, they want to use language deftly so that it's fit for their purposes. This book is for them. Well, that made me excited. I'm actually reading this for my work at Crossway as a books editor. It's one of the books that they asked me to purchase. They purchased it for me so that I could have it as a reference work, and it really is fantastic. I've been leafing through it. Is that the right word to use for a Kindle Scribe? Not sure. One of the neat things about this Kindle Scribe, I guess this is the main feature for some people, and it kind of remains to be seen how much I will use it, but I'm liking it so far, especially for PDFs, is that it comes with this stylus, and I'm able to write out my notes and thoughts. And I wrote this. You can see it right here. Reading Garner on prescriptivism versus descriptivism is fascinating. It showed me the revolutionary role of computers in the work of lexicographers and writers of style guides, like Garner is. He's actually both. Garner has a sophisticated viewpoint which mixes observation of what writers actually do, and he uses big data to make these observations. We'll see that in a minute. He mixes that with logical arguments about what seems to him to be the best usage for various reasons that aren't necessarily rooted in observation. But even those reasons, those arguments for why you should, for example, not put periods inside acronyms like NASA, those arguments go away once usage has spoken definitively. That's what I wrote down. Now let me unpack that a little bit. And I do think this is relevant to English Bible translation because we have to understand how we understand the state of the target language into which we translate something. And I think what Garner has done is a very careful evaluation, a calibrating of the strength of descriptivism and prescriptivism. Again, do we tell people what the rules are, capital T, capital R, or do we observe what people in fact write and say? Or do we mix those two? And I think that is, again, what Garner has done so effectively. He talks about 10 first principles in his work. Purpose. The purpose of a usage dictionary is what we just read before, to help writers, editors, and speakers use the language effectively. His value, his principle is realism. He wants to give advice that people can actually use in the real world. Simplicity, clarity, succinctness, word judging. A word or phrase is somewhat undesirable if it has any of the following characteristics. It blurs a useful distinction. It defies logic. It threatens to displace an established expression but hasn't yet done so, like let's hearken back versus let's hark back. He talks very carefully through this. Differentiation. If related words begin to take on different senses, he says, it's wise to encourage the latent distinctions when they're first emerging and then to follow them once they're established. Needless variance. He thinks you shouldn't have, it's needless to have two or more variant forms that don't convey distinct meanings. Conservatism. if two constructions are current, but one of them has been widely condemned by acknowledged usage authorities whose values are in line with those outlined in number 6, that is, word judging, the other construction is better. But then listen to this. Number 10 principle of Garner's authoritative usage guide, actual usage. In the end, the actual usage of educated speakers and writers, whether traditionally educated or self-educated, is the overarching criterion for correctness. But while actual usage can overcome the other factors, it isn't the only consideration. He gives an interesting example later, and it is that word criterion. There are many people who use the word criteria in the singular. They would say the overarching criteria for correctness, and they mean that in the singular form. That is improper, strictly speaking, because of the original, etymology of these words. Criteria it is a Greek word, or was a Greek word that's become an English word, and for some of these hoity-toity words we hold on to the plural forms, like cherubim is plural, though you can say cherubs. That refers to those putti, those little babies, naked babies with wings, whereas the cherubim, we use that Hebrew plural to refer specifically to the cherubs, the cherubim in the Hebrew Bible, those angels, okay? Sometimes we hold on to linguistic forms that we don't really understand, that aren't really part of our language for specific reasons. And criterion versus criteria, that distinction is holding up, I think, and I think Garner says, among professionals. And that's what I am. I'm an editor. I work for a Christian publishing house. That's holding up, but it could go away. It could go away if enough people start to say criteria all the time rather than criterion ever. I think we're on our way to that. I don't think we're there yet. If I'm a Bible translator right now, and if for some reason I needed to use the words criteria or criterion, I would observe that distinction. And I do think Bibles tend to do better, especially if they're on the more formal end, to be more conservative, to uphold that principle that Garner mentions. However, if time passed and I noticed, this rule that I observed in my youth has now gone away in actual usage, I would eventually bow to actual usage. It isn't the only consideration, but it is the ultimate consideration. Listen to what Garner says. Point number 10, actual usage, acknowledges that in time the facts of what users of the language actually do will settle all disputes. But the problem of following statistical evidence of what actually occurs is that things are slowly shifting, and professional writers and editors can't wait around to see what direction language takes. They must make decisions, and by doing so, they influence that direction. That's brilliant. That was really helpful for me. I was on the edge of getting there already, but he articulated for me in a crystal clear way the factors that come into play when I make usage decisions. The fact is that as Garner continues on in his preface here to his Modern English Usage, a very famous and well-respected book, and a massive one. It's a lot thicker than this. I'm not sure how thick, but it's got to be huge based on the leafing through that I've done. As he moves on, he shows what I mentioned earlier in the little note that I took, the way that computers have revolutionized the ability of style mavens and guides like this to give good style advice. Through a computer and through massive corpora, bodies of English literature of various kinds, collected from news sources, collected from literary works, collected from historical works, you can observe the way people actually use the language. You can observe, as Garner does, whether self-deprecating, which is the only form that I've ever heard, is actually winning out over self-depreciating, which he says was traditionally viewed as correct. Very interesting, because my editor's ear, my English ear, my writer's ear, tells me that self-deprecating has absolutely won, given that I don't ever remember hearing self-depreciating, and if I did, I would have seen it as a solecism. I would have seen it as an error. In fact, there is a 45-to-1 ratio in the Nexus database. That's a news database. and the ratio in American judicial opinions is 62 to 1. Another source that Garner uses very carefully. I've actually avoided this source because using it carefully is very difficult. I feel like it casts too broad of a net. It's Google's Ngram viewer, Google Books Ngram viewer. And its corpora is based on millions of English language books. He said it yields a ratio of 25 to 1 from just the year 2019. So actual usage has anointed self-deprecating over self-depreciating. If you wonder, therefore, what counts as contemporary English, we now have more sophisticated tools than ever, and they're in the hands of regular people, certainly of scholars, but even of regular people, to determine, well, what is formal English now? How do we spell a given form? What do people in fact say? Garner gives another example. Have you ever heard this one? Do you hone in on something or do you home in on something? There's a reason why homing in on something is giving way, especially among less formal writers, to hone in on something. Home in comes from homing pigeons, and because we don't have them anymore, they went extinct, that connection is not as strong in people's minds. In fact, it's just absent in most people's minds. I'm not sure I would have known that if I hadn't read this. Maybe I would have guessed it accurately. But hone in on sounds very similar, of course, and it sort of sounds like honing a blade, getting just to that sharp, sharp edge. If enough people say hone in on rather than home in on, then the phrase has changed, and they're not wrong. And in fact, I'd say, given their circumstances, most people are not wrong to say hone in on. It's changing. I think to stick with home in on is a way of expressing my membership in the club of people who care about such things and who buy and actually sit down and read in their $10 thrift store chairs Garner's Modern American English Usage. I want to end this somewhat rambling video by reading to you what he says about prescribing versus describing. The first several editions of this book, and they started now 25 years ago in the late 1990s, those editions made much of the 20th and 21st century debates between descriptivists and prescriptivists. Should we encourage normativity? In other words, should we adopt the prescriptivist viewpoint? And this is a very interesting question coming from the writer of a massive usage guide, which weighs in on thousands of usage questions. He says the debate is old and it has grown stale. Increasingly, it's passé. Descriptivists, who seek to describe language without judging it, have in recent years tacitly accepted some degree of prescriptivism. And I would say that's me. When you're young and you find out there's no heaven-sent rule, there's no actual, the dictionary that tells us the way things actually are supposed to be, the real meaning of a given word. No, we find that through usage. It's kind of like when a kid realizes the difference between fact and opinion and then goes around observing it everywhere. I think that as a young, immature man, I was a little too gleeful in my overturning of prescriptivist rules. But the fact was, I still observed them. When I overturned them, I was only saying they don't have any heaven-sent authority. I knew at some level I was always going to be a prescriptivist. I liked following the rules, even at that awkward, immature age when I was saying I was flouting them. Now listen to this. Knowledgeable prescriptivists who seek the best uses of language have based their judgments more and more on empirical descriptions of English usage. One point that he brings out a little later on in the book, as I was just kind of leafing through, he talks about the way British English and American English handle acronyms. American English used to put periods between the letters of acronyms more often. NASA might, for example, have N.A.S.A. But as those acronyms have become more and more common, maybe, who knows exactly why this is, the periods have dropped away. It used to be people observed a distinction between words, like acronyms that were themselves, words, like NASA has become, hardly anybody ever calls it the National Aeronautics and Space Administration anymore. They just call it NASA. It's its own word. You can see how that would tend to eliminate the periods. And in British English, it's actually gone to the place of lowercasing the last letters, uppercasing only the first letter. He gave an example. I'm not going to find it right here. I think IFSA or in for something program in Britain. I really don't know. Maybe my British viewers know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to be able to find it while I'm talking. And in British English, he showed that that acronym actually gets a capital letter at the beginning and the rest of it is lowercase. If you are not sure what to do in a given case, a usage guide can help you. And where does that usage guide get its information? It's not from some universal logic, although that is appealed to. It is from ultimately actually observing what people do. So there could be a situation in which it's appropriate to write NASA with all periods. Maybe in 1952 that was the case. There could be situations today in which it's appropriate not to use those periods, but to use all caps. NASA might be the way we do it in the US, but capital N, lowercase ASA might be the way that they do it in Britain. And when in Rome, you need to do as the Romans do. I've long felt that knowledge of language, knowledge of linguistics is very, very important for Bible interpretation. I think that I've had a hard time putting my finger on why. There's sort of a sixth sense that develops among people who love language when preachers are wanting to ask language to do too much. They're wanting to assign too much meaning to a given word, too much theological meaning to the word agape, for example, or they're wanting to find a very, very precise distinction somewhere, or they're mixed up by some archaisms like Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. Preachers, I have a video about this, will say that the which refers back to the whole phrase, I can do all things through Christ, that knowledge strengthens me, versus it's Christ who strengthens me. A study of language will acquaint you with, it's like that story. This is so silly, but I've thought of it so many times. It's such a hokey illustration, but I think it's just so apt when it comes to language. The little boy wants to learn about jade. Like why, I don't know. So he goes to the ancient Chinese master and says, I want to learn about jade. And the master says, here's some jade, and hold on to it. And then the master goes on talking about all kinds of other things for hours. And then the boy says, well, I thought we were going to learn about jade. And he says, I'll come back tomorrow. He comes back the next day. The master hands him some jade again. He goes on talking. The whole day, he doesn't even say a thing about jade. The boy's been holding it all day. The boy says, why didn't we talk about jade? The master says, oh, come back tomorrow. The master hands him something that isn't jade. And immediately the boy says, that's not jade. Somehow you can learn some things by osmosis. And I think if you want to find the most enjoyable way to learn to be a good Bible interpreter, of course, the theology portions and the original language portions of study, the hermeneutics study, the understanding that the Bible tells one story, all of that is absolutely important and valuable, and I use it every day, all the time. But the most enjoyable way to learn is to listen to John McWhorter or a guy like Brian Garner who give their advice about the way language works and who observe the way language changes over time. I think that will sensitize you to the languages used in Scripture, will remind you in an intuitive way, the way the boy holds the jade, that those languages were spoken by real humans, not by robots, that those languages were not perfectly logical any more than our language is perfectly logical, that the kinds of fine distinctions that people often want to find in biblical language because they assume, and I understand this, that Holy Spirit inspired words would be infused with their utmost meaning. Actually, no, the right way to go about hermeneutics is to look for the least contribution of a given word to any sentence. I get that from Moises Silva, who most certainly has an even more refined sense for how language works and how that ought to impact our Bible interpretation. I think if you want to learn jade, then hold on to it. If you want to learn Bible interpretation, and I'm sorry for how long I've rambled, then pick up Garner's English usage, read the preface, listen to John McWhorter's Lexicon Valley. He's not a Christian. Watch out for some cuss words, but it's excellent stuff. Listen to the History of English podcast. Listen to Anne Curzon and her great course on language or dictionary making or something like that. There are numerous lexicographers out there who will talk to you very intelligently about language if you'll just listen. And if you'll listen, I think you'll gain some real wisdom for Bible interpretation. I've got to add a little bit to the video. I'm going to do something here I've never done before. I have a, help the cause level of YouTube membership, and I have an early access level of YouTube membership, and I've got a number of folks supporting me extra there, which is much appreciated. One of them who supports me in many, many ways, not least through lots of great ideas and some great edifying texting conversations, is Eric Couture. I'm not totally sure how to pronounce it. Sorry, Eric. And when I put out this video that you just saw for early access, he commented on it and reminded me of something I should have known, that the book that you can kind of see over my shoulder behind me, HCSB, the Bible, let me look. Navigating the Horizons in Bible Translation. The HCSB is the precursor to the CSB. In that book, which came out, now I'm not going to know, but I got it in 2014 on Kindle. So says Amazon today. It actually mentions Brian Garner in its discussion of the way they evaluated English and in its current state for purposes of translating the HCSB, which has subsequently become the CSB. And the kinds of things that you're about to hear them use Garner for are the kinds of things that are still in the CSB. So without further ado, I'm going to read from some of these things. Both functional, dynamic, and optimal equivalence translations aim to render the original language in such a way that it sounds natural in standard English. Okay, so that's the question. How do we go about doing that? How do we determine what counts as standard English? One reason for this is to keep at a minimum the effort required for a reader to process what he or she is reading. Now, that doesn't mean that we make it as dumb as possible. It means that we eliminate unnecessary processing costs, as it were. The HCSB aims at American English. A very important guide toward this goal is Brian A. Garner's A Dictionary of Modern American Usage. Now, they're citing the 1998 edition. The edition of modern usage that you see up on the screen behind me didn't come out for a number of years after that, after the HCSB, so they did not have access to it, and the title was changed a little bit. But the basic gist is the same, and you'll see that as you listen to them quote Garner. Garner explains, this is the HCSB translators, Garner explains that the purpose of his book is to, quote, help writers, editors, and speakers use the language effectively to help them sound grammatical but relaxed, refined but natural, correct but unpedantic. You'll recognize that as sounding very similar to what he said in the current edition of his Modern English Usage. Furthermore, his goal, which matches that of the HCSB, and why shouldn't it? Why shouldn't a translation aim to be grammatical but relaxed, not too intense, so hoity-toity in its speech? Why do I use that phrase? I'm not sure. Refined but natural. I mean, that's a difficult tension, but one that translators of good English Bible translations aim at. Furthermore, his goal, which matches that of the HCSB, is not to uphold an imagined pristine state of the language from 100 or more years ago, and we might as well just say 400 years ago. But, quote, in the end, the actual usage of educated speakers and writers is the overarching criterion for correctness. That did not change. Back in 1998, Garner was saying that, and the HCSB translators pick up on it. They also mention, they quote him, Garner, while actual usage can trump the other factors, it isn't the only consideration. They noted back then in 1998 that his guide to usage, Garner's, is based primarily on the canvassing of millions of published documents through online databases, from which he draws about 5,600 illustrations. And, if anything, he's got far more than that, or at least more than that now. It's fantastic and important work. So they cite him how? How do they use Garner's insights into modern American English speech and writing to influence the HCSB? The first example they give, and I'm going to give 1, 2, 3, 4-ish examples. I think 4 examples. The first one they give is that Garner gives wisdom on the matter of contractions in serious writing. He says, although, this is the HCSB translators, although many writers feel uncomfortable with contractions, and here's Garner, perhaps contractions don't generally belong in scholarly journals. Okay, fine. Nevertheless, Garner says, why shouldn't writers use contractions in most other types of writing? What contractions provide, says Garner, is relaxed sincerity. There are his principles at work. So here's the HCSB. In Genesis 3, this is the first instance of a contraction in the HCSB. Did God really say you can't eat from any tree in the garden? And here's God warning Cain, if you do what is right, won't you be accepted? Manifestly, that is what we would say. Why is it that the Bible is it supposed to sound stilted and not relaxed? Should it have to say, did God really say, you cannot eat from any tree in the garden? Or is God supposed to speak, uber proper English, American English, you cannot eat? I'm sorry, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? Who says that? I mean, it does get said, but it comes with an added level of formality. It's not relaxed sincerity. And that's the HCSB translators letting a modern American usage expert describe English for them and then translate accordingly. Okay? Here is another example of naturalness in the occasional use of prepositions at the end of a sentence. Okay, here's the second issue. Can you use prepositions to end a sentence? The HCSB translators not only cite Garner, they actually cite the King James, which itself uses prepositions at the ends of sentences. They said about 400 times, take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, which thou lovest, get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. So even the King James broke this rule, which isn't really a rule. And Garner just, kind of mocks it in a good-natured way. He quoted Winston Churchill, who knows if he actually said this, but, insisting that you can't end a sentence with a preposition is, he said, that's the type of errant pedantry, absolute, too great attention to grammatical supposed rules. That is the kind of errant pedantry up with which I shall not put. Garner's bottom line, says the HCSB translators, and now we quote Garner, is that good writers don't hesitate to end their sentences with prepositions if doing so results in phrasing that seems natural. Okay, there's Garner again, giving assistance and aid to the HCSB translators, but not disagreeing with the practice of the King James translators as it happens. Okay, here's a third example of the HCSB translators using Garner. Another way that they achieve naturalness is to avoid archaisms. And a good example is the word shall, they say. In traditional grammar, the simple future called for shall only in the first person. I shall go there. I shall return. But for an expression of determination, promise, or command, shall was used only in the second and third persons. Thou shalt not, or thou shalt. And will was used in the first person. I will go there. In modern English, however, shall is usually encountered only in questions requesting permission or agreement. Shall we go? And it's even a little twee, as John McWhorter says. It's, it calls attention to itself a little bit. Or it's used in legal documents where shall expresses obligation, kind of like it does in the Ten Commandments. Otherwise, according to Garner, shall is rarely used in American English. Therefore, the word is not found in the HCSB. That has to be okay. Tradition tells us to say thou shalt not, and that still has certain resonances in our culture. I'm not going to get rid of those resonances, and I don't know that I care to. But nobody talks that way, and hardly anybody writes that way. So if you're going to translate into modern American English, you need to reflect that fact. That's all the HCSB translators are saying. Another example here is the word whom. Grammatically, it's an objective relative pronoun. It's used as either the object of a verb or the object of a preposition. But, especially in questions, it's rapidly being replaced by who. So, Brian Garner quotes someone with the stature of William Safire, who used to write, I think, for the New York Times, well-known, internationally, or at least nationally known column on language. Safire said, when whom is correct, recast the sentence. I don't know when that was said, but it was said at least prior to 1998. And I have to think the word whom has faded even further since then. So in Genesis 2:8, the NRSV from 1989 has, "There he put the man whom he had formed." But that's more naturally rendered in the HCSB, according to the advice of Garner. "There he placed the man he had formed." You don't have to say whom. They hardly even had to recast. The NRSV has Genesis 16 saying, "Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael." That's more naturally rendered in the HCSB. "Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son Hagar had." Now you could say, well, but shouldn't the Bible be more formal English? Shouldn't it be excellent English? Well, yes and no. I think that the Bible ought to reflect the Hebrew and Greek. And if the Hebrew and Greek made people cock their heads and say, well, that's a kind of a funny way to say it, as best, if we know that, then maybe it would be appropriate. I think it would be appropriate to use English forms that are that way. But by and large, we want to translate into the language as it's actually spoken and written. Another example, grammarians like to talk about what's called the Oxford comma. So you've got a list of at least, 3 or more individuals or things or places: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Do you put a comma after Levi and before Judah? I always have. I am fundamentally conservative, it turns out, when it comes to the rules that I learned as a kid and teenager and college student. I don't give them up unless someone with the stature of something like Garner tells me I have to, or the stature of my boss at Crossway or at Lexham Press, where I used to work as an editor, and they tell me that, okay, the style guide, we've all agreed, is going to say such and such. Of course, that style guide is discussed by editors, and it is it appeals ultimately to usage, the way people tend to actually speak and write. I like this. I'm a conservative in that matter. I think it avoids confusion. And Garner says the same thing. The only way to, in an ironclad way, be certain that you're not going to cause confusion is to use the serial comma, the Oxford comma. So I wanted to show you that Brian Garner's advice, followed by the HCSB translators in these 4 or 5 instances, whatever it was, I failed to count well. It didn't always go against the King James, like with the objects of the prepositions ending sentences. It isn't fundamentally liberal. Here with the Oxford comma, he's sticking with tradition in order to achieve clarity. But it's willing to go against tradition where English has changed. And I say English, I mean in this case, American English. What else are we going to do? How do you define English? I frequently get comments. I got one like this, I think yesterday, on my channel saying something like, well, the King James is English. How can you possibly talk as if it's a different language? And of course, I've carefully said many, many times, it's not a different language, but it is a sufficiently different version of our language. That, revision of the King James, I think, is called for, especially in institutional settings like churches, pulpits, mission boards, publishing outfits, children's curricula, signage. In institutional settings, we need to use words that people can understand. And people are just exasperated with me for acting like the King James isn't our language. It's English. Okay? Well, how do we define what English is? What is English? It is, and I love this definition, a group of people who agree to understand one another. Of course, we mean it's the set of signs and symbols and sounds and rules, all that go in that, into that we call our language English. And we don't have that agreement with the Elizabethans because they're dead, and our English has moved out of phase with theirs. People like Garner are going to be able to help English Bible translators when they need to make the difficult decisions, but that even go against our own inclinations. I am more traditional, maybe even especially as I get older, but I've actually been, like, surprise, surprise, I've always been pretty conservative in my personal life and in so many ways. I was just preaching the other day, and I pointed out I tend to follow pretty much the rules that my parents had for me as a kid. I don't follow them all. But the sort of lifestyle that they tried to inculcate in me is something that I still live. I am just by nature more conservative. I'm sure by nurture as well. So why am I pushing like this? because we have to ask, what are we conserving? And what we're conserving is not a given Bible translation. We're conserving the principle of vernacular translation. There was a time when shall and shalt and whom were more commonly used. There was a time when thee and ye were distinguished from one another. Those times are gone. We don't speak that way anymore. English has changed, and if you need help determining when it has, and therefore how to translate a given phrase into the English that we actually speak, you can pull up Garner's Modern English Usage.